Whether you're just getting started with watercolor landscapes or you're looking to practice essential techniques so that you can arrive at better results more consistently, this tutorial is for you. In this one, we're painting a simple but vibrant nature scene. And I am taking you through my entire process, starting with my preliminary pencil sketch, all the way through layering watercolor for depth and detail. We're bringing in wet on dry, layering, splattering, blooms, and I'm even sharing how to paint a simple but believable sky, as well as how to paint believable trees from imagination. So let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, starting out with our sketch, I would recommend sketching lightly so that you can erase any mistakes as you go, and also so that your pencil work is not visible through your watercolor at the end. I'm keeping this sketch very simple, making sure that my shapes and lines are irregular, making sure that perspective makes sense. I want to make it so that things that are farther away look smaller than things that are closer to us as the viewers of the scene. Always considering what elements are in the foreground nearest us, what elements are in the middle ground, and what elements are farther back. This is a nature scene, so I am making sure that all of my shapes, my lines are imperfect, irregular, nothing looks too drawn out, and I'm making sure to stay away from anything that looks like a pattern. This is a landscape that I came up with from imagination, and whenever I am planning for a new landscape, whether I am using a reference photo or I am creating the composition fully from imagination, I always take time to sketch out a few thumbnails to make sure that I'm arriving at a nice looking composition that has an asymmetrical balance to it and is interesting to look at. I also make time to plan my colors before jumping in. The first thing that we're going to be painting is the sky, and we're going to keep it nice and simple. What I'm preparing right here on my palette is a puddle of plain cobalt blue, and I'm also going to prepare a mixture of cobalt blue with a little bit of Payne's gray. This way I have a bit of a darker, more grayish blue that I can use to create a bit of a tonal range in the sky and maybe provide a little bit of a sense of shadows in the clouds. My puddles on my palette, I would say, are like a coffee consistency. They do have quite a bit of water in them, but they are not super watered down. Once my puddles are ready on my palette, I use my larger mop brush to pre-wet the entire sky area all the way down to the horizon line and all the way down to the edge of this little hilly area on the right. I do paint over the tree because I want the blues in my sky to be visible through the little windows or holes that I'm going to be leaving unpainted in the tree leaves. Once my entire sky area all the way down to the horizon line has been pre-wetted and I see that nice even sheen, I go ahead and start painting in my cobalt blue, starting at the top and making my way down so that the top part of the sky looks a little bit darker than the bottom. I use kind of horizontal brush strokes and make sure to leave some sections of my paper alone unpainted so that those white areas can look like clouds. Once my cobalt blue has been painted in, I add in a little bit of my grayish blue right under some of these clouds for a bit of a shadow effect. If you want to deepen or intensify the blue in certain parts of your sky, you can definitely pop in a little bit more of your plain cobalt blue into some areas here and there, but make sure that you're not overworking things and blending things out too much because that can lead to flat results. And if your paper starts to dry, I wouldn't recommend doing anything else because that can lead to textures and splotchiness and undesired effects. You can see how I didn't place too much paint in that leaf area in the tree, but some of that blue did get into the trunk section and the branch, and I'm totally fine with that because the browns that I'm going to be using in those shapes are going to cover up the light blues behind them. Okay, so it's now time to paint the ground, and I am first making sure that I know what I'm going to be doing for my browns and my greens, and I am preparing some puddles of color on my palette to have them ready to go. I prepared a puddle of raw sienna plus burnt sienna for a lighter brown, a puddle of burnt umber, a puddle of undersea green, and I also created a mixture of undersea green and lemon yellow. Aside from this, I've created a mixture of alizarin crimson and a little bit of burnt umber for the little flower blooms that I'm going to be creating. I added a little bit of burnt umber into the alizarin crimson just to mute it down a tiny bit. With my color mixtures ready, I changed my water because I wanted to make sure to use clean water for the pre-wetting that I would be doing. And I went ahead and used my larger mop brush to do my pre-wetting in the entire ground area. And I also pre-wetted the tree line in the faraway distance. If your sky is not 100% dry and you want to avoid any possible backruns or bleeding, I would recommend allowing that to dry completely before doing your pre-wetting and painting in this new area. Once I arrived at that nice even sheen all throughout the ground and the tree line in the distance, it was time to start painting in my greens. I started with the lighter green, which is my mixture of undersea green and lemon yellow, and placed it in a very irregular, loose way all throughout the grass areas. I didn't directly place any green in the dirt road, but if some of that green started seeping in, I just let that happen. With my lighter green in, I then started dropping in some of my darker green, and that's plain undersea green. It was my objective to develop a nice range of green values all throughout the grass area, always starting with the lighter color and making my way toward my darkest color. I changed to a smaller size 14 round brush and did the same thing to paint in the tree line in the faraway distance, starting with my lighter green and then adding some darker green, which is plain undersea green, here and there for that nice range of green values. Everything was still wet and workable, so I went in to darken some areas even more with my plain undersea green. I mostly went into those areas where I have sketched in my shrubs and little plants here and there, and that's where I pushed the darker greens. Once I painted in the green areas, I removed that green from my paintbrush bristles and I painted in the dirt road, starting by placing my lighter brown, which was that mixture of raw sienna and burnt sienna. And while that was still wet, I dropped in a little bit of burnt umber, which is my darker brown that I'm using, here and there to darken some shadow areas. Just a moment ago, I went in to do a little bit of lifting with my absorbent towel in that lower portion of the sky because I had a bit of a backrun happening or a splotchy effect since I started painting in that tree line at a point where the sky was not entirely dry. Fortunately, I was able to fix that very easily by just going in and doing some lifting. Everything is still wet and workable because I took my time with the pre-wetting process, which pre-wetting extends our working time. So while everything was still wet and workable, I switched to a smaller size 3 round brush and I started dropping in some red blooms. So this was alizarin crimson plus a little bit of burnt umber. I'm barely touching the tip of my paintbrush with my red color onto the green, which is still wet, and that paint travels down the bristles of my paintbrush. The red paint pushes that green, which is still drying, out, and this creates a beautiful soft bloom. For this to work, of course, the green still needs to be wet. And the longer the tip of your brush is in contact with your paper, the larger the bloom will be. And I just make sure to place these blooms in a very irregular way, clustering them together in different ways. And then it was time to allow all of these larger washes to dry completely. Once everything was dry, it was time to start painting in my first layers in my tree. For this, I am using my size 14 round brush. I explain my 2-layer tree painting technique thoroughly in another video, which I'm going to make sure to link to down below. But in this first layer, I am developing a nice range of green values from lighter greens to mid-tone greens in that leaf area. And I am using a mixture of scribbling and bouncing to make sure that the leaf area is very irregular, asymmetrical, and has a lot of irregularity along those edges, as well as little windows or holes that I am leaving unpainted throughout the leaves where I can see the background. It is helpful to shift and change the angle at which you're using your brush, and also the amount of pressure that you're exerting on your brush as you're painting in these shapes, because this will help you develop those abstract, irregular shapes that you need for organic elements like plants and trees and even flowers. Here, I'm using the clean and only slightly damp bristles of my brush as a little absorbent sponge to do a little bit of lifting in areas that I feel I darkened a little bit too much. And then it was time to paint the tree trunk and that little section of that branch that is coming off toward the right. So for this, I'm going to use a smaller brush. This is a size 3 round brush. And I'm first going in with my raw sienna plus burnt sienna mixture, the lighter brown, to paint in that first lightest brown layer. You can see how I'm leaving little sections of paper shining through. That helps me communicate a little bit of that wood texture. And with that first light brown layer still wet, I go in to darken shadow areas with my burnt umber, which is darker. I am thinking of places where shadows would be, under the leaves, behind the shrubs. Doing a little bit more lifting again while that green is still wet, revealing a little bit more of that paper under that paint so that the leaf area can have a bit more dimension to it. And then it was time to allow that to dry and move on to the next thing. I switched on over to my size 4 round brush, and what I am doing is painting the shrub wet on dry now. I first go in with a mixture of undersea green and lemon yellow, paint in a very abstract, irregular shape for that shrub under that tree, and make sure that you're painting around your red flowers. Otherwise, you're going to cover them up or just make them super muted. Because you're painting wet on dry, you're being left with sharp, defined edges around the shapes that you're painting in. So if at any point you want to soften any edges, especially along the lower edge where the plant meets the ground, you can go ahead and do that easily while the paint is still wet. If you want to darken certain areas even more, go in with your plain undersea green or with a thicker version of your plain undersea green. Once I'm done painting in that shrub, I switch to my size 0 round brush and I create some short, slightly curved, tapered brush strokes here and there to help convey some longer grasses coming out from that shrub. Then I switch on back to my size 4 round brush and do the exact same thing for the shrub in the lower right, painting around those red flower blooms and starting with my lighter green that has the lemon yellow in it, then doing a little bit of softening of edges using a clean and only slightly damp brush, and then I go in to darken certain sections within that shrub using my plain undersea green. My objective here is always to develop a nice range of green values. I don't want to go in too dark too fast and create a very stark looking shape or a very flat shape. Having a range of values throughout whatever area or element it is that you're painting is going to help you stay away from flatness and heaviness. You're going to notice here that I remove that paint from my paintbrush bristles and soften especially the lower edge where the plant shape meets the ground. And I continue using a combination of scribbling and stippling or bouncing motions with my brush to paint in those shapes. Once I was done, I added in some grasses with my smallest size 0 round brush, making sure that these lines that I'm creating are tapered at the end and also slightly curved and clustering together in different ways. I don't want to go in and create a very stiff looking line or mark. And I switched on over to my size 14 round brush to darken certain areas in the dirt road. I first went in to paint in some abstract shadow shapes on the road with my burnt sienna, and I kept those shadow shapes more so along the edges where I wanted to create some shadow shapes. And while that burnt sienna was still wet, I dropped in a little bit of burnt umber, which is even darker here and there in deepest shadow areas, to create an even wider tonal range in the road. And here I am going in with a clean and only slightly damp brush to soften edges. With that done, I then painted in that last shrub on the left, going through the same process that I was using for the previous shrubs. starting with a bit of a lighter green, painting around the red flowers, making sure that my edges are very irregular, softening any edges that I might want to soften, and then finishing up by adding some longer grasses using my smallest size 0 round brush. With this technique, we are simultaneously developing a wider range of values by pushing those darker areas, but we're also developing textures. And it's good to remember that with this medium, less is more. By this point, the tree was already dry, so it was time to get to work on that second layer in the tree. And the objective with the second layer is to create some shadow shapes wet on dry now. And this is all done from imagination, but it is good to bring to mind what you know to be true about what it is that you're painting. Even observe reference photos of whatever it is that you're painting so that you can ground your painting in reality. So what I'm doing is I am imagining clusters of leaves, right? This entire leaf portion of the tree has lots and lots of clusters of leaves that are creating shadows on each other. The shadows are what I am painting right now. It is not my intention to cover up too much of that initial layer, but to darken shadow areas. I'm using my size 4 round brush and painting in these irregular shadow shapes underneath and along the sides of clusters of leaves. Again, using a combination of scribbling and stippling or bouncing, sometimes using just the tip of my brush to create little teeny tiny shadow shapes, and other times pressing down the belly of my brush a little bit more to create larger shapes. Less is more. Once I was done there, I took a quick second to do a little bit of scrubbing where I wanted to soften the edges of my green shapes around some of my red flowers. I just used a small, clean, and only slightly damp brush to do some gentle scrubbing along edges that looked a little bit too sharp to me around these flowers, just here and there. Then I moved on to darken some of the upper edges of my trees in the farther away distance. I'm still using my size 4 round brush for this, and this is a mixture of Undersea green and lemon yellow. It's pretty watered down. I don't want to overly darken the trees farther away because aerial perspective tells us that things that are closer to us are darker in value and more detailed and more contrasting. And if I go too dark with those elements in the distance, I can fail to communicate that depth and can confuse the viewer in terms of what is closer and what is farther away. And then this is what I would call the last part of the process, where I am observing the entire piece as a whole. I am noticing if there is anything that I want to darken a little bit more, and noticing if there are any final details that I want to add in. When it comes to my tree, at the end, I usually like adding a few little leaf shapes here and there just by doing a tiny bit of bouncing with a small brush. Just essentially taking a little bit of green from my palette and pressing down the tip of my brush onto my paper. Since I am using round brushes will help you create teeny tiny leaf shapes as you're using the bristles of your brush as a type of stamp. And I'm also missing my smaller branches, which I can add in at this point now that everything is dry. It's important to use a smaller brush. I'll be using my size 0 round brush for the branches. I want to make sure that especially as they make their way away from the main trunk of the tree, they get more and more narrow until they end up at a tapered point. If you've never painted branches before, I would recommend drawing them with your pencil first and making sure that they look very asymmetrical and irregular. Notice how I'm jumping over certain leaf portions so that they can look like they are coming out from behind clusters of leaves. And finally, before my splattering, I decide to go in and darken certain shadow shapes in the tree trunk using my burnt umber. I'm darkening certain sections of my smaller branches. And I also push the contrast in the shrubs and in little areas here and there in the dirt road. I do go back to my size 4 round brush for these smaller shadow shapes. using the same colors that I was using before. So for the shrubs, I go in with my Undersea green just to darken those final darkest dark shadow shapes, keeping everything very abstract, very irregular, and using a clean and only slightly damp brush whenever I need to soften any edges. And for the dirt road, I do go back to my burnt umber and just push certain areas here and there to increase that tonal range. And this is completely optional, but I decide to finish up the piece by doing some splattering for visual texture and interest, especially in this lower part of the piece. It's important to use a paintbrush that has a snap to it, a little bit of a stiffer bristle, if you will. This is a size 16 round brush, just as an FYI. And I am making more of my Undersea green plus lemon yellow little puddle on my palette, kind of a coffee to milk consistency. And then I just use a kind of cross motion. I hold one of my larger brushes in my left hand and then tap over that brush with this stiffer bristled brush that I'm doing my splattering with. A little bit goes a long way. First, I go in with my green color mixture, and then I go in with my red color mixture, my Alizarin crimson plus a little bit of brown. I do make sure to cover up those sections where I don't want any splattering with a couple of scrap pieces of watercolor paper that I have around. And if you're concerned that maybe your paintbrushes are not going to be any good for splattering, or maybe the consistency of your paint is not what you need it to be, I would recommend practicing your splattering on a scrap piece of paper before doing it on your painting. I really hope that you enjoyed this watercolor tutorial and that you're able to give this one or something similar a go for yourself. Thank you so very much for joining me on this one. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy your art practice and see you very, very soon.